Don't be fooled by this shabby hat. Beneath this hat hides a top business acumen. This little black boy named David is a shoe-shining boy. But pay attention. He chooses to set up a stall in front of the bank intentionally so that his customers are all rich white people. He doesn't care about the little money earned by shining shoes. He works slowly so he can hear the financial secrets white people are talking about while they wait. As soon as they leave, the little boy writes it down in a notebook. All he really wants is the valuable financial knowledge he hears from them. From a very young age, he knows that his lifelong dream is to become a banker. This is Mississippi in 1939, a place where black people are oppressed by severe discrimination. His father tells him sadly that his dream is impossible, but David's eyes show determination. Against all odds, 15 years later, the grown-up boy moves to Chicago with his wife Linda and children. The racial discrimination here is not as serious as in his home, so he decides to start his business here. The family of 3 has to live in a dilapidated utility room of one of his relatives. Still, David promises his wife that they will move out soon. He starts as a real estate agent and searches for houses for sale everywhere in the city. Through keen observation, he finds that the black community in Chicago is overcrowded, while the white community still has many empty houses. Black people have rental needs and financial strength, but there is no market. This is a great business opportunity for real estate speculation and renting. He sees a white-owned apartment with weeds on the front door, obviously not in very good condition. Still, only he sees the advantage of the house's location, which is adjacent to the black area. He goes to the owner and says, "You only rented out half of the apartment, so why don't you sell it to me? I'll give you $30,000 now and another $5,000 when I rent out all the rooms." Although the owner admires his idea, he doesn't want to do risky business. David expresses his understanding. Before leaving, he suddenly glances at the owner's calendar, which shows that it was given by a local bank manager. So an idea comes to his mind. He says goodbye to the owner and goes to the bank directly, where he finds the manager who sent the calendar. The manager's secretary, who discriminates against black people, refuses to introduce him to the manager. He waits for a few hours at the bank door, and when the manager comes out, he stops him immediately. He says, "I know one of your VIP customers. The business I do will benefit him, and I hope you can approve a loan for me." But the bank manager rejects him without thinking. That night, he receives a call from the owner. The owner asks him, "Did you use my name to try to get a loan?" He has no choice but to apologize. Unexpectedly, the owner doesn't blame him, but admires his belief that he will not give up until his goal is achieved. The owner decides to guarantee the loan for him, so he gets the first loan in his life from the bank and buys the property. An old white lady has just come home from shopping when she sees a black man at her door. "What are you doing?" she asks with a sharp voice. The black man answers calmly, "I'm renovating the apartment building." The old lady speaks with a mean face. "Workers like you should be careful." David responds, "Don't worry. This is my building, and I will definitely take good care of it." Speechless, the old lady goes home angrily, and the police come soon after. They tell David that an old lady called them and asked if he pretended to be the owner and contradicted her. Unexpectedly, David takes out a copy of the real estate certificate. It turns out that he had foreseen trouble, so he was prepared in advance. The police realize that the house really belongs to him, so they leave in a huff. That night, David returns to the apartment building. The old lady at the door sees him and immediately tells him to get out because it is not the time for renovation. David still replies calmly, "I am not a renovation worker now. I am the owner." The old lady is dumbfounded, and a few days later, she moves out angrily because she doesn't want to live in the same building as black people. As soon as the old lady leaves, David rents out her house to a black lady. Sure enough, the black tenant market is huge, as he had foreseen. The building is quickly filled, and David gives the negotiated follow-up payment to the former owner. The former owner admires David very much and offers to start business with him. David chooses the house and calculates the income, and the old owner negotiates the transaction and signs the contract with him. White people won't know that they're doing business with black people, and they will split the revenue. David readily agrees. The cooperation between the two goes very smoothly, and they make a lot of money immediately. David also moves from an apartment block to a mansion shortly after, providing a happy life for his beloved family. Several years later, in 1963, David takes his family back to Mississippi to visit his father, Charles. After their dinner, Charles tells David that he's proud of his accomplishments. The next day, David walks around town with his son. Before they know it, they're standing in front of the bank where David worked as a shoeshine boy. At that time, Mississippi was the most racist place in America. They meet a young boy shining shoes just like David used to when he was little. To David's surprise, the boy will only work on the shoes of white people. This little incident touches David and awakens his sense of responsibility to his fellow man. He secretly makes up his mind that he must change the status quo and help the black community in his hometown get better housing. The next day, David visits Mark, his business partner, and tells him that they should buy the Union Bank in Mississippi. Mark thinks David is out of his mind for even thinking about it because the racism in Mississippi is so severe. But David manages to show compelling reasons to make the purchase. David manages to convince Mark to help him out, and they recruit Tom, a trusted associate, to be their frontman once more. They meet with the bank owner, Richard Patterson Sr. and Jr., to discuss the deal. Despite Patterson Jr.'s suspicions, Sr. eventually sells Union Bank to Tom and his partners. With Union Bank acquired, David gets to work and starts helping the African-American community in town get approved for loans. It seems that David's goal is to help his fellow men get a fair chance at housing and even money-making opportunities. Things go well for a time until Patterson Jr. starts investigating the loans that their bank approves. One day, Patterson Jr. follows Tom and meets up with David and Mark. He confronts them about the loans they approved and threatens them with a letter from the U.S. Treasury Department. He says that the department will inspect the bank's operations in 1 month. As Patterson Jr. leaves, the guys discuss their next moves. During that time, Tom comes up with a suggestion. He proposes that they buy another bank and transfer the problem loans from Union Bank to that bank. They discuss the purchase of Franklin Savings Bank, and David says the main problem is overseeing the operations of the new bank. In response, Tom suggests that he be allowed to run the bank himself. David expresses his discomfort with the idea, but he eventually settles with letting Linda keep an eye on Tom. In the end, Tom gets to run his bank just like he wanted. The next day, Tom meets up with a lawyer and starts signing loan contracts on his behalf. Sometime later, Tom receives a call from Patterson Jr. regarding clients who want to withdraw all their money from Union Bank. To make matters worse, a federal bank examiner arrives at Franklin Savings Bank to conduct an audit. David forces himself to dress up as a janitor so he can get close during the meeting. Unfortunately, it doesn't make a difference since the examiner discovers a critical problem with several loans. David is in disbelief that such absurd loans got approved. Eventually, they learn that it was Patterson Jr.'s doing all along. It turns out that while rushing to run his bank, Tom skipped protocols and used a lawyer that Patterson Jr. recommended. Through that, Patterson Jr. was able to sneak in the problematic loans. Sometime later, David and Mark confront Tom about the loans while Patterson Jr. watches the spectacle with a proud look on his face. David tells Tom to get their books, but it's too late. The Federal Reserve revokes Union Bank's license to operate. While leaving the building, the FBI arrests David and Mark. David tries to stand his ground, but it's a futile struggle. Sometime later, David and Mark meet with their lawyer. They learn that their case has been dragged into racial politics in the country. Meanwhile, Tom talks with Senator Wilson about testifying against his partners in exchange for his freedom. That night, Tom contemplates his next move and makes a phone call. Tom follows Wilson's suggestions and testifies against his partners at the Senate hearing the next day. Later that day, David also meets with Wilson and listens to his proposal. He gives him a choice: to take an immunity deal and confirm Tom's testimonies, or to say whatever he wants and go to jail. In the end, David decides to say the words that have been kept in his heart for years. He talks about racial discrimination in the country. Shortly after that, both David and Mark's fortunes are decimated. After the hearing, the two are sentenced to federal prison. Patterson Jr. purchases Union Bank for a fraction of the price that David and Mark originally paid for it. Meanwhile, Tom never gets charged with any crime. Several years later, David and Mark get out of prison. Linda finds it strange that the two men seem happy, even after losing all their fortune. It turns out that's not the case at all. Mark reveals that they have properties next to each other in the Caribbean. Linda is in disbelief and asks David how that happened. It turns out that the man Tom called the night before his testimony was David. Tom told David about the senator's deal and apologized to him. In return, David asked Tom for a favor. Before the government could seize their assets, Tom helped them secure their properties overseas. The story ends with the revelation that David and Mark's real estate ventures were instrumental in the fight against housing segregation in Chicago, and they still own two mansions next to each other in the Caribbean.